There were hundreds, if not thousands, of really small, like 4 to 6 inch cutthroat trout in that portion of the river. And it just made me, really hopeful that we're doing the right thing here and we're really making a difference in this population.
Thanks for tuning in to the Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast, where we share the stories and science of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I'm your host, Emmy Reed. Is there any fish species in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem more iconic than the Yellowstone cutthroat trout? While the name conjures imagery of a ruthless nature, these fish are called cutthroats due to the distinct red markings found along their jawline and gills. Yellowstone cutthroat trout are a keystone species here in the region, providing food to countless species including bears, otters, osprey, and more. Yellowstone cutthroat trout are also at the epicenter of one of the most interesting species recovery stories from the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Decades ago, when an unexpected threat appeared in Yellowstone Lake, the population of Yellowstone cutthroat trout in the park was decimated. This important link in the Greater Yellowstone food web was in big trouble, and something needed to be done. We're pleased to welcome to the podcast Andi Puchany, a fisheries biologist at Yellowstone National Park. She joined the park's native fish conservation program in 2014, and her work focuses on native fish conservation, population recovery assessments, and lake trout reproductive ecology. Andi received her bachelor's in zoology at North Dakota State University and her master's in fish and wildlife management at Montana State University. Join us on the episode to learn how to identify a Yellowstone cutthroat trout, what happened all those years ago to cause a decline in Lake Yellowstone, how these remarkable fish rebounded, and what makes her hopeful about her work today. I hope you're hooked. Let's jump into the conversation. All right, thank you for joining us today, Andi. To start us off, did you dream about becoming a fish biologist as a kid?
I would say that I was definitely the child that was playing in my dad's minnow bucket. The minnows that he was using for bait during ice fishing might have ended up in my bathtub once or twice.
How did you find yourself working at Yellowstone National Park?
So I was in my third year of my undergrad program attending North Dakota State University, and I was actually a pre-vet major at that university. And I had been thinking for a little while about switching to wildlife and fisheries. And I started looking into job opportunities and had a contact in Yellowstone National Park. And when I reached out to that contact, he mentioned my now current boss, Todd Cool, and the Native Fish Conservation Program. And so I applied to the internship out here, which is through the Student Conservation Association. And after obtaining that internship, I was like, I got a taste of the mountains and the beautiful, pristine lands out here. And I was like, this is what I want to do. I don't want to leave. And I really haven't ever since.
Nice. And why fish?
Well, I would say I just kind of fell into it. I wasn't particularly wanting to work with fish specifically, but I did get the internship, and I think that's what kind of propelled me into this career. And I think there's something special about fish that not everybody gets to see them. They're under the surface of the water, and it makes them more elusive, more intriguing than a lot of other animals that someone could work with.
Absolutely. So, today we're here to talk about one of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem's most amazing native fish species. And let's start at the very beginning and with the basics. What is a Yellowstone cutthroat trout?
A Yellowstone cutthroat trout, it's a species in the Salmonidae family that happened to colonize this region of the upper Yellowstone and Snake rivers following a glacial recession around 8 to 10,000 years ago. And it's a beautiful aquatic invertebrate hunting slimy thing that is a wonderful organism to behold.
Wonderful. And how do you identify a Yellowstone cutthroat trout?
So it's most often talked about with its morphological characteristics as this really gold bodied fish that has these relatively large spots on a typical specimen. And these large spots are mostly congregated towards the tail of the fish, and there's not a ton of them. At least in the typical species, there are varieties of Yellowstone cutthroat trout that are more fine spotted and have a lot more spots than that. And then, yeah, the beautiful yellow body is really the namesake of the species, and it's why it's called what it's called.
I feel like I'm not an angler myself, but I feel like I hear from anglers that it's a very prized fish, to catch. Do you, have any idea why that is?
I do. I really think that although the Yellowstone cutthroat trout isn't one of the biggest and most ferocious fighting fish species, it definitely um, lives in a very special place in this upper Yellowstone River and Snake River drainages, which I think is a really special thing to behold when you're an angler, looking for these fish and you capture one in these drainages. And this isn't anything new. Anglers have been coming to Yellowstone for decades and decades to capture this prize species. And I'll say that, when you catch a really beautiful colored up specimen, it really is a special thing, because I think one of the reasons is that they're so beautiful. Some of these spawning species can be these beautiful, dark, golden, red, or crimson, even sometimes dark purple color. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't get in a lot of species is that really red, vibrant colors. And I think that's why it's pretty special.
Where do they rank in sizing when it comes to other trout species?
Well, there are a lot of hatchery strains of, like, say, rainbow trout that will get a lot bigger than Yellowstone cutthroat trout. But the Yellowstone cutthroat trout specimens in Yellowstone National Park, specifically Yellowstone Lake, are very large. We just had a fish caught that was 24.5 inches, which is you'd be hard pressed to find another cutthroat trout species that large, maybe besides cutthroat trout in Pyramid Lake. It would be the only one I could think of.
Gotcha. I hope there was a camera available. I feel like I often find anglers who are like, "Yep, it was, 2 feet long. Fortunately, didn't have my camera."
Yes,
Yeah.
I actually do have a picture. This specific fish came up on a boat, and what made it most, I would say, what made it like most makes you look at it and go, "Oh my gosh, that's a big fish!" Is it was really girthy. So I can share that photo with you at some point if you'd like to see it.
Absolutely, we'll be dropping that in the show notes for our listeners to check out as well. So now that we've got some of the basics about Yellowstone cutthroat trout, can you tell us why they are so important to the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem?
So they're known as a keystone species, meaning that these fish are vital to the ecosystem and they are an intricate part of that ecosystem. So there are several different species that rely on Yellowstone cutthroat trout as a food source and that have evolved with them for thousands of years. So grizzly bears, black bears, otters, eagles, pelicans, gulls, loons. I could go on and on about the species that prey on Yellowstone cutthroat trout. I think we have over 21 species. And one thing that I am really excited to say is the last 2 years, we've actually had evidence of foxes eating Yellowstone cutthroat trout in a local tributary right by some employee housing. So we actually have photos of these foxes with Yellowstone cutthroat trout in their mouths. And yeah, so they're that's a new species that I'm not sure we had documented before. So I would say, yeah, there's 21 species plus more that we haven't even counted yet.
That is so cool. I would have never guessed a fox eating fish. I mean, I know they're pretty opportunistic, but I'm like, yeah, foxes, voles. That is it. But how cool to discover that.
It's very, very cool.
Is there another weird or interesting fact about Yellowstone cutthroat trout that you could share with us today?
I was looking up some things that I wanted to talk about, and one just kind of kept falling into my lap that I really wanted to say is that The Yellowstone Cutthroat Trout has gone through a whole bunch of name changes throughout its history in our linguistic system. And so, most recently, in the last couple of years, there has actually been a change in the genomics documentation of this species that they're now being called a subspecies of the Rocky Mountain cutthroat trout. And so I just thought that was super interesting. So its scientific name has changed once again.
Really? Well, hopefully the Yellowstone cutthroat trout will stick around for a bit.
Yes, I think that we'll always still call it the Yellowstone cutthroat trout.
Sounds good. So one of the big reasons I wanted to do this podcast episode is people who maybe live in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem or are just familiar with angling in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem know about the saga that has unfolded in Yellowstone Lake with Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And it's been interesting to me because it was one of the first conservation issues I learned about when I started working at GYC. So this has been on my list to dive more into the details about. But could you tell us what happened in the 1980s and the 1990s in the lake related to these fish?
Yeah, so everything seemed to be going well. We had this beautiful population of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. But then on July 30th of 1994, a angler was fishing with a guide and caught a lake trout that was about 17 inches long. And this guide realized, hey, that fish isn't supposed to be in this lake, and immediately notified park officials. And this was like an oh no moment for park officials. And immediately a $10,000 award was offered for information, leading to any kind of insight about what and how these fish could have gotten into Yellowstone Lake. And shortly after that, there were more reports, like on August 15th. More fish were reported, and then people started showing photos of like previous years where the same lake trout species had been caught in Yellowstone Lake. And then some of those previous reports dated back even to the mid 1880s. So clearly a population had been developing for a little while, unbeknownst to the people who were managing the lake population.
Wow. How did lake trout get into Yellowstone Lake?
So there are a handful of hypotheses about how that could have happened. Some are more likely to occur, and some are a little bit less likely to occur. But the leading hypothesis is that they were illegally introduced into the system from a neighboring lake called Lewis Lake, where these non-native trout had been intentionally stocked.
Wow, how did they know that they came from Lewis Lake?
So there was, and there is this pretty cool technology called otolith microchemistry. And otoliths are little bones in a fish's ear that contain water quality signatures from the lakes that these fish have dwelled in throughout their life. And so we were able to determine from these otoliths that the signatures of strontium and nitrogen in these specific lakes matched back to what that fish's growth was at that time of its life. So that's how we were able to backtrack that fish were indeed from Lewis Lake and then introduced into Yellowstone Lake at some point in time.
Gotcha. And are lake trout native to Lewis Lake?
They're not. They were introduced previously, and the park has a long history of non-native fish stockings throughout time. When people first started to arrive and explore Yellowstone, more than 40% of Yellowstone's waters were historically fishless, and it was looked at as an opportunity to stock these waters, to provide angling opportunities for people all over. I think the thought was that, the more species, the bigger they can get, the better the ecosystem is. And it wasn't until later in like the 1930s when we really had the science to say, hey, these non-native fish stockings are reducing our populations of our native fish.
What's the difference between Yellowstone cutthroats and lake trout, and how do they interact?
So, Yellowstone cutthroat trout are spring spawning species, and most of the ones in Yellowstone Lake are adfluvial, meaning that they live most of their life in the lake, but they travel and migrate to tributaries to spawn. And so, this is when Yellowstone cutthroat trout are vulnerable to predation by different species, such as bears and bird species, eagles, especially, and um, and this makes them available. It's also moving nutrients from the lake ecosystem to these tributaries. Conversely, we have lake trout, which are a species that spawns in the lakes themselves, so they never travel to tributaries to spawn, and they also spawn in the fall. So it's a completely different timing of their spawning season. So when they move in shallow in the fall, they spawn in some shallow areas of the lake, but it's at a different time of year, potentially when bears aren't going to try to hunt them down because they're not as pressed for nutrients, in the fall as they are just coming out of hibernation. So, so that's a couple of reasons. Additionally, they live at different depths in the water column in the lake itself. So, whereas cutthroat trout are generally 12 meters and shallower in the water column, lake trout generally live deeper in the water column than that. And so it makes lake trout completely inaccessible as a food source, and therefore they are not an ecological replacement for cutthroat trout.
Gotcha. So, do they just experience competition for resources?
So they there's a lot of research going on right now about whether juvenile fish do overlap of the two species do overlap and compete for resources when they're young. So we're trying to figure some of those questions out. But additionally, lake trout are a predatory species, and a lake trout can eat, upwards of 40 some cutthroat trout in a year span. And so this highly predatory species started to prey on cutthroat trout. So once lake trout get to be a certain length, they switch from eating mostly benthic invertebrates to eating fish, and that's called piscivory.
Okay, so fast forward, Yellowstone National Park has made the decision to do something about the lake trout. Could you tell us what that decision was and how it came about?
Absolutely. So immediately after the discovery of lake trout in Yellowstone Lake in 1994, the Park Service convened a panel of scientists and researchers in 1995 to kind of talk about, and make management decisions on what should be done to essentially eliminate the lake trout from the system, because they knew that this predatory species could decimate a native cutthroat trout population. And so, not too long after that, a gill netting program was implemented to start to remove non native lake trout from the system. And, that program started in the early 2000s. I'm sorry, it started in 1995, and this is actually the 30th year anniversary. But things started ramping up as far as gill netting in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And that's when we really realized we needed to start to get a handle on this lake trout population, because our gill netting efforts at the levels we were doing them at previously wasn't enough to cause a decline in the growing lake trout population.
Got it. And so, yeah, what does that lake trout suppression look like today?
So we realized that we really had to ramp up our effort. So, for example, in the early 2000s, we were generally removing less than 50,000 lake trout a year. But in the more recent years, we've been removing between 250,000 to 300,000 lake trout per year. So we really have increased the amount of effort put out onto the lake. And this was really made doable by the hiring of a contract gill netting operation to essentially, who were essentially uh, experts and professionals at removing fish from systems, and this is what they do for a living. And that really allowed us to tackle this lake trout problem and get on top and start to decline the abundance.
Right. Can you tell me about a day on the gill netting boat on the lake? Like, is it early morning, out late? Is it fun? Is it stinky? What's it like?
It is all of the above. um, um, and probably one of the best jobs you could have on this lake because you get to handle fish every day. But it's a very taxing job. Most folks wake up at 4:30 in the morning to be out on those gill netting boats by 5, and we really try to hit those early mornings to avoid afternoon wind weather, and so it just makes the day easier when you can beat the wind. And essentially there could be 50 miles of net set in the lake at any given day during peak netting season. And so the boats go out to the nets and pick them up. There's a buoy on either end of the net, and they pull those nets in with an automated puller, and the fish start coming in, and then the fish are picked out of the nets. Any live cutthroat trout are released back into the lake immediately, and then all lake trout are held and killed.
And I guess, like, those buoys and gill netting, do you often come in contact with recreators, or people see the buoys and stay clear?
People are generally good about seeing the buoys and staying clear. Sometimes there are lures that get caught in the nets, and those are prized possessions held by the captains. They get to keep those.
Nice. Does he have, like, like a little trophy display?
It's definitely a trophy wall. Um, and so, yeah. And then, no, generally the lake is so large that
Yeah.
while there are many recreationists angling on the lake, it's pretty easy to avoid people when you're out there.
Nice. Are your suppression efforts working?
So, yes, we have made huge strides in the last few years suppressing the lake trout population. So, compared to the peak lake trout population size in 2012, especially with adult fish, which are fish that are around 6 years and older, we've reduced the number of those adult fish by 80 to 90% in recent years. And not only are we seeing signs of recovery of Yellowstone cutthroat trout in our data, we're observing it anecdotally as well, by reports of anglers capturing more and more cutthroat trout in streams and rivers and in the lake. And we're also seeing it in the ecosystem. We're seeing a return of bears to spawning tributaries to feed on cutthroat trout. There are a couple of really great videos on YouTube out there of bears fishing for cutthroat trout again. And excitingly, we're starting to see an increase in the number of birds that historically relied on cutthroat trout, including eagles. And ospreys have been a little bit slower to recover. Um, we still don't have a nesting pair of ospreys, but in the last few years, we have been seeing ospreys back at Yellowstone Lake. And so these are all things that are really exciting for us and are pointing to recovery.
Nice. So you're seeing more cutthroats and larger cutthroats.
We are, yes.
Will you ever catch all of the lake trout?
So with the current technology that we have, we don't want to say that it will never happen, but with the current technology that's available to us, we don't have the ability right now to eliminate the entire population. But there is a lot of cool new research out there that always has the potential to be applied to a population once, say the lake trout population got small enough. There's this cool technology out there called YY males that essentially alters the sex of a fish and of a fish population to become all males. And so, if we ever got the lake trout population small enough, that is one thing that could potentially be there as an option, but we're just not there yet. We really need to use our gill netting suppression operation as a tool to maintain the lake trout population at low enough levels that we are not ruining, or we're not allowing them to consume the cutthroat trout as the levels as it was at in the late 2010s, in the early 2010s.
Nice. That's always cool because there's always new technology and new ideas coming out. So I'm excited to see how lake trout suppression evolves.
Yes.
Uh, what makes you hopeful about the work you do?
So I am an angler, and last summer I spent an evening after work fishing on the Yellowstone River. And I know everyone always gets so excited about the really large Yellowstone cutthroat trout that you can catch, but as a biologist and always being excited about the new year class coming up, I get really excited about the young fish and the little ones coming. And so, I was just thinking about last year and this evening that I had on the Yellowstone River, and there were hundreds, if not thousands, of really small, like 4 to 6 inch cutthroat trout in that portion of the river, and it just made me, really hopeful that we're doing the right thing here and we're really making a difference in this population.
Is it right if we move into some listener questions?
Of course.
Great. Um, Tyler from Idaho asks, what would happen if lake trout took over Lake Yellowstone?
So I think that we would see a bounce back to what was happening in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and that would be historic low numbers of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. A loss of these species in the ecosystem, resulted in the predators that rely on them switching food sources or becoming non-existent in the lake ecosystem. And so, we saw what that was like, and we really don't want to be in that situation again. So that's why we need to continue the suppression program into the foreseeable future.
Could you tell us about a memorable moment out in the field?
So in 2023, we did a big sampling event in the upper Yellowstone River back in the thoroughfare region, which is generally an understudied location because it's really hard to get back in there to sample because of the remoteness of it. And a bunch of biologists and Park Service employees, in conjunction with the state of Wyoming and researchers from Montana State University, went back to sample and collect genetics on the Yellowstone cutthroat trout spawning population back there. And we ran into outfitters and guides who had essentially stopped fishing in the upper Yellowstone region because the cutthroat trout population had declined so badly due to the lake trout predation. And when we were back there, these folks had mentioned that the fishing had never been better, and they were, so happy to see cutthroat trout returning to these tributaries to spawn again, and bringing people back to fish for them and successfully fish for them. So that was a really special story to hear.
Oh, I love that. Where can people learn more about your work to protect Yellowstone cutthroat trout?
So, our native fish conservation program puts out an annual report, and I believe our 2024 report should be available on the website here very soon. And so, we have a website on our Yellowstone National Park .gov page. Let me look that up really quick to see exactly what it is.
Yeah, you can send that over to me, and I'll make sure to put that in the show notes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we have a website on Yellowstone National Park's page, and we put out annual reports, and it's also where we publish all of our scientific research. So it's a great resource to know what's happening, what has happened in the past, and what will be going on moving forward.
Do you have a favorite fish besides Yellowstone cutthroat trout? And why?
I do have a favorite fish besides the Yellowstone cutthroat
Of
trout.
course, of course.
Shocker, it's another native species in Yellowstone National Park. It's called the Arctic grayling, and it's probably one of my favorite species because I feel like they're my problem child. It's one that we've been trying to restore for a while, and they just tend to be a little bit finicky about establishing, and so that's where a lot of my work has been focused in the recent years. And it's also the first fish that I ever caught on a fly rod, and so that's why it's pretty special to me.
That is so special, I love that. Um, so to wrap up our conversation, this is a question we ask all of our guests is, who is your conservation hero?
I would have to say Marty Murray, who
Mhm.
is considered the grandmother of the conservation movement. She was the first woman to graduate from the University of Alaska and was just a huge advocate for the protection of wilderness areas. And a lot of her work culminated in the establishment of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and as well as the passage of the 1964 Wilderness Act, which protects now millions of acres of federal land. And I also just really, I guess, identify with her because she and her husband and her children were quite the adventurers. I think on their honeymoon, they went, on a 500-mile trip to study caribou, and my husband and I like to adventure together, and we believe in a sustainable, harvesting and opportunities, which she and her husband did as well. So I think that's who I would consider my conservation hero.
Ah, perfect answer. Love it. Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today and sharing your knowledge about our wonderful Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And I hope to see you out on the rivers this summer.
We'll see you out there, Emmy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy, for joining us on the podcast. We hope you have a successful netting season this summer, and we appreciate all you do for our wonderful Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Listeners, I've placed a few links in the show notes that Andy mentioned, so make sure to check those out. The Voices of Greater Yellowstone is a podcast by the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, a conservation nonprofit that works with all people to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Please rate and review the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune in and help us reach more people to share the stories and science of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And make sure to sign up to become a podcast insider to receive a Voices of Greater Yellowstone sticker, ready to stick on your water bottle, laptop, or wherever else you want to rep the show. As always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.